Good afternoon, Amanda, and thank you for the lovely introduction. I am about to be joined by art historian Dr. Baseggio, and together we will start this new webinar which we named Venice, the Entrepreneur City. Before we dive in, I would like to take a moment to thank Friends of FAI, Fondo Ambiente Italiano, whose priceless mission is to restore, preserve, and promote Italy's cultural heritage, which they do in the broadest way possible, in an interest range that spans from art and architecture, landscapes, villas, and churches. It is because of organizations like FAI that nowadays we are still able to visit and enjoy the jewels of Italy's extraordinary cultural history. I am joined now by art historian Dr. Baseggio. I want to thank you very much for sharing your time and knowledge with us today.
Thank you very much to everyone.
So Evelyn, this year is a very special year for Venice. Can you explain to us what that means?
Yes, 2021 marks the 1600th anniversary of the birth of Venice. If we believe what the Venetian chronicles tell us, the Venice was born on March 25th, 421 Anno Domini. Historians, however, have proven that this date is spurious, and it's more likely that Venice was founded in the second half of the 6th century, when people from the Veneto mainland were running away from the Lombard invasion. This German tribe, coming from Pannonia, which is a region comprising several territories in the northeast of Europe, such as present-day Hungary, were responsible for the decline of the Roman Empire, as well as indirectly for the rise of Venice. It's through these migrations that the millennium history of Venice originated. The most serene republic, as it's often referred to, stood free, surrounded by its waters, from roughly the 6th century until 1797, when Napoleon came and set foot for the first time on Venice as a foreigner invader. What is most impressive is how Venice evolved from a bunch of small islands in shallow waters into this marvelous city and powerful maritime empire. Visitors coming from the outside, not very differently from modern-day tourists, were amazed when they first set foot on Venice. The city was not only splendid, but looked like miraculous, being born out of the water in such an hostile environment. The testimony of Felix Fabri, a German friar coming to Venice on his way to Jerusalem in the 1480s, can give us an idea of what kind of impression Venice left on these early visitors. As we sailed farther on, we found before our eyes the famous, great, wealthy, and noble city of Venice, the mistress of the Mediterranean, standing in wondrous fashion in the midst of the waters, with lofty towers, great churches, splendid houses and palaces. We were astonished to see such weighty and such tall structure with their foundations in the water. The illustration that accompanied this quote comes from the first illustrated travel book of another German pilgrim, Bernhard von Breidenbach, who also visited Venice in the same years as Felix Fabri. These texts function as preparatory guides for pilgrimages toward the Holy Land, which was at this time a quite risky journey.
So, from what you're telling us, it sounds like there was a connection between pilgrims and Venice. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. Pilgrims can be considered Venice's first tourists. Starting in the 14th century, Venice was chosen as the privileged harbor for pilgrimages toward the Holy Land. And being the astute merchants that they were, the Venetians understood quite early that they could turn this possibility into a profitable business. So the Venetian government appointed an office called the Tolomari, who were responsible for assisting the pilgrims in preparation of the trips, finding them lodging, and especially taking them around the city like a sort of predecessor of modern-day tour guides. Venetians really made an effort in trying to transform their city into a pilgrimage site itself, showing off their beautiful churches replete with precious relics. And to this day, there are actually in Venice 148 churches, which is not that much in comparison with the over 900 that can be counted in Rome, but it's still quite an impressive number for a small city like Venice.
So, from what you're telling us, it really sounds like Venice was trying to promote an image of itself.
Yes, they did. They were really putting a lot of effort in providing us a personification of their city. And this phenomenon was not unprecedented in the Italian Renaissance, but the consistency with which Venetian promoted this image of Venice as a beautiful, noble, and pious Matrona through historiography, legend and cults, and artworks was quite unparalleled. We can see a great example of this sort of personification of Venice in the painting by Paolo Veronese that I'm going to show you, executed for the Ducal Palace of Venice, which was the seat of the Venetian government, and where you can find actually a bunch of images of this kind.
I know from previous lectures of yours that many artists rose from the Venetian art scene in the 16th century. So is there a reason why you picked Veronese specifically today?
Paolo Veronese, together with Titian and Tintoretto, was among the most important artists in 16th century Venice who were actually asked to immortalize the glories of their city. However, what distinguished Paolo Veronese is the bright colors of his pictures and the aristocratic elegance of his figures and the magnificence of his painted architecture, but particularly his ability to really create like a theatrical spectacle with his creations. I would dare to say a painted entertainment for the viewer's eyes. You can see that in the way that he uses the architecture as a stage-like backdrop for the unfolding of the story, and how he studied carefully the costume details and the figures' gestures. Veronese was deeply connected with the greatest architect of the Renaissance, especially Palladio, and was often employed as a costume designer in theatrical representations. I chose him for the same reason the Venetian government probably chose him, because it was definitely the most appropriate candidate for creating a splendid stage for this apotheosis of Venice. This canvas stands on the ceiling of the Hall of the Great Council in the Ducal Palace, one of the largest halls of this kind in Europe. Over 1,000 patricians, representatives of the government, gather weekly here to make the laws and nominate officials, but also to welcome diplomats and ambassadors. Venice is the young woman sitting on the clouds, dressed in a royal garb and being elevated into the heaven. She is garbed in a golden brocade gown with an ermine cap which is similar to the one used by the Doge, and holds a scepter. As you can see, she's being crowned by flying victories. Surrounding her are personification. To start with the upper left, we can recognize honor with a laurel crown, peace with the olive branch, happiness with the stick with the intertwined serpents, which was used by Mercury to mediate the fights, and then security, abundance with the cornucopia, and freedom. For those of you who are familiar with religious painting, this image should call to mind right away the iconography of the Virgin Mary being crowned as the Queen of Heaven. It's not a coincidence that this same scene is alluded in the gigantic canvas painted by Tintoretto for the Hall of the Great Council just behind the seat of the Doge. The parallel between Venice and the Virgin could not be more clear here. Just below Venice, the Venetians standing on the balcony are witnessing the glory of their city from a privileged point of view, while underneath on the ground we can see the nation governed by Venice, kept under control by the omnipresent Golden Lion of Venice and soldiers on horses to signify the powerful army of the most serene republic. It's interesting that among this crowd there are also some foreigners depicted. On the bottom, barely visible, I can discern a turban, and in the middle center of the painting actually, we can identify both a Muslim figure and a Jewish figure on the right side of the painting. Behind the main Matrona at the center, there is a Moorish slave. The fictive classicizing architecture bears an unusual detail: two imposing twisted columns that calls to mind those in Gian Lorenzo Bernini's baldachin, created for St. Peter's in Rome a century after. Both these columns likely refer to a group of spiral marble columns from Old St. Peter's, which were thought to have been brought there by Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, from the Temple of Jerusalem. Paintings such as Veronese's must have particularly pleased the Venetian government. Venetians always put a lot of emphasis on their city appearance, especially in front of external visitors.
Venice had to dazzle.
So all these myriad of churches and noble palaces and lavish festivals were organized and designed with the sole purpose of creating a scenography of splendor, as we can see in this painting by Gentile Bellini, the official painter of the Republic at the end of the 15th century. This painting really contains some very important elements of Venetian ideology.
We're about to see this painting by Gentile Bellini. Was this also commissioned by the government?
Actually, no. In this case, this painting was commissioned by the Scuola Grande of San Giovanni Evangelista, one of the many charitable institutions in Venice, and was meant to commemorate this precious relic of the True Cross, which was among their most prized possessions. I have to be honest with you, at this time, several institutions and churches claimed to have a piece of Christ's cross, but the one in San Giovanni was special because it was coming from a very authoritative source, which was Constantinople. It was believed that the largest portion of Christ's cross was left there by St. Helena, mother of Constantine. St. Helena was the one who rediscovered Jesus' cross and then distributed several pieces around the world between Jerusalem, Constantine, and Rome. So the precious relic of San Giovanni Evangelista was not only authentic, but was also very special because it worked many miracles. So the member of the confraternity decided to commission a series of paintings commemorating the miracles of these precious relics of theirs from prominent artists at the time, and they also published a booklet telling all the stories.
Gentile Bellini commemorates here the yearly procession, which was organized on April 25th in occasion of the feast of St. Mark, the patron saint of the city.
During this procession, the sacred fragment of the True Cross was paraded through the street of Venice. The person kneeling in front of the reliquary is a merchant coming from Brescia who was in Venice to deal with some business when he heard that his son was going to die for a blow on his head. Knowing that the relic of the True Cross was going to be paraded through the city of Venice the day after, he decided to ask for a miracle, and that's how his son was cured. Even though the miracle itself, together with the reliquary and the members of the confraternity, are represented in this prominent space in the painting just in the forefront, Gentile Bellini's image is much more than simply a commemoration of an historical event associated with the piece of the True Cross at San Giovanni Evangelista. It's a representation of the greatness of Venice in all its components. The sense of order that the procession evokes is reflective of the perfect organization of the Venetian government. The unity and peace of the Venetian is the result of their sincere and profound piety.
The power and beauty of the city, represented by the view of the Basilica and the Ducal Palace, are a sign of the divine favor.
In order to make the Basilica and the Ducal Palace more visible, Gentile Bellini decided to move the actual location of the bell tower more to the right. What is interesting is that in this ordered totality, which comprises senators of the Republic in red gowns, patrician and citizen in black, and the various exponents of the religious institution of Venice, we can spot actually some foreigners strolling by just in the middle of the piazza as bystanders. I can easily identify 4 Greek merchants, 3 German merchants, and 3 Turks. Foreigners were often invited to attend these special ceremonies that attested the greatness of Venice, but also the solidity of its social order.
We really can't help but notice a resemblance between the golden reliquary and the golden facade of the basilica in the background. Is there a meaning behind that?
Well, as you're pointing actually at the second reliquary in the painting, because the Basilica of San Marco can be read as a sort of like a gigantic golden reliquary, because it was built with the sole purpose of preserving and commemorating the body of St. Mark, patron saint of Venice. The 5 mosaics above the portals that we see the detail now are narrating the story of how the body of the saint was literally smuggled from Alexandria of Egypt in the 9th century to Venice by 2 Venetian merchants. It's kind of like a very interesting story. And it can be read from right to left and from east to west, almost mimicking how the kind of itinerary that the body of the saint would have taken arriving in the harbor of Venice and coming into the basilica. Gentile Bellini actually represent an historical record of how the mosaics originally looked like, because 4 out of 5 of them were substituted in the 17th century. The only original one remains the one in the farther left corner of the basilica, which dates to the 13th century. The body of the saint is carried on the shoulders by the clergy and welcomed by the Doge and other representatives of the government, together with the Venetian people. Again, to express the sense of unity of the Venetian population and their deep identification with the saint. This section alone, and its decorative complexity and variety of components, is emblematic of the overall style of the basilica, which is a sublime accumulation of different elements. The pointed arch with reliefs in the shape of figures and vegetations against a gold background recalls luxurious Arabic Moorish effects. Inside the big lunette, there are 4 patere with the emblems of the evangelists, which are dating to the early 14th century. Just below, 5 small embroidered Byzantine windows, and on the architrave at the bottom are some early Christian fragments, probably dating back to the 5th century, representing scenes from the New Testament. For example, Christ and the Apostle, the calling of the shepherds, the adoration of the Magi, and so on. I would like to spend a few words on the patere and to explain to you what these interesting objects are. They are stone medallions decorated with bas reliefs of the animals and plants, which are ubiquitous in Venice. You can find them almost in every wall. They derive from the ancient East, and they bear specific moral meanings associated with the concept of good and evil. For the pilgrims and visitors coming into the basilica, the mosaics really represent a sort of like a perfect introduction to the magnificence of the interior. When inside the basilica, the visitor has the impression to be inside a jewelry box. We are dazzled by the 4,000 square meters golden mosaics of the ceiling, telling stories from the Old and New Testament. The goal is to make the visitor live a transcendental experience, to transpose him to a different dimension, that of the celestial Jerusalem, to which Venice intended to be associated. Venice actually was often associated with several cities at once, sometimes Constantinople, sometimes Rome, sometimes Jerusalem.
Just out of curiosity, where was all this gold coming from?
That's a good question. We don't know with certainty, but it's likely that Venice acquired the gold through the many trading posts that the city had throughout the Mediterranean. The same can be said about the variety of elements that characterize the exterior of the basilica, which really gives the impressions of a patchwork. Although the building was modeled after a specific example, which was the Church of Santi Apostoli in Constantinople, it was then constructed amassing a variety of materials, mostly coming from that city, but also from the many trading hubs that Venice had all over the Mediterranean. For example, Alexandria, Beirut, Damascus. I'm showing you this map to give you a sense of the extension of the Venetian maritime empire.
It's clear at this point that trade was a great strength for the city of Venice, but would you agree that it was more of a necessity coming from a weakness that they had?
Well, of course, since the Venetians were actually living basically in a territory with no natural resources. For example, they didn't have even clean water to drink, or they couldn't have like land where growing crops. They have to be independent, resilient, and creative since the beginning, and use their spirit of innovation. And they understood quite early on in their history that the greatest possibility was coming for them from the water. The water was protecting them, and the water was opening a sea of possibilities. The city grew as an international emporium where all sort of merchandises could be found. And this tendencies to amass things coming from different places within the world and mixing styles and languages, it's almost what you feel everywhere in every street of Venice, and it's something that gives you the sense when you walk around that you're not in Italy, but you are in a different world suspended between the East and the West.
So this is an aesthetic that we don't only see in San Mark, but we see all over the town. So can you expand on that?
Exactly. It's a sort of blend of a Gothic and Veneto-Byzantine and Oriental motif that really dominates everywhere in Venice. Let's look, for example, at the Cadoro, which is one of the most beautiful patrician palaces facing the Grand Canal. Built for the patrician Marino Contarini, who was a wealthy merchant and today a museum, Cadoro is emblematic of Venice's multicultural makeup. On the contrary of the residential architecture that was developing everywhere in Italy, especially in Florence, the palace stands out for its asymmetrical design, its colorful components, and the windows decoration that calls to mind the intricacy and sophistication of lacework, one of the products most popular in Venice. We see here Gothic arches and tracery, and the Islamic-inspired cresting along the roof lines. According to Contarini instruction, who followed closely the construction of his palace, the facade was to be painted with white enamel and ultramarine blue, and the red stone were supposed to be oiled to shine brighter. Much less ornamented than the Cadoro, yet still responding to the typical Venetian Gothic architecture of the mid-1400s, is Casa Bortoli, once known as Casa Contarini. The palace is one of the monuments in Venice that has benefited the support of the Friends of Five. As we can see in a number of Venetian palaces of the time, the facade is characterized by a symmetrical distribution of openings, with open loggias at the center and two windows on the side wings. The pointed ogee arch that we see here, as well as the Cadoro, is an hybrid cultural detail. Found in English Gothic, it also occurs in Asian architecture. So more than being an Oriental motif, it's an allusion to the mental image of the Orient.
What about the interiors of these buildings? What did they look like?
Well, the same eclecticism that characterized the exteriors of this building was also the criteria followed for the interior decoration and for the collection of items within. Even though the majority of this collection don't survive today, especially those dated from the Renaissance, they were dispersed throughout the centuries, we'll still have records of the items that were in there, which are in written documentation, such as, for example, inventories and wills. We also have this very interesting document written by the Venetian patrician Marcantonio Michiel, who at the beginning of the 16th century went around the most beautiful and lavish collection of his fellow patrician and wrote down some notes about them. What Michiel emphasized is this blend of modern sculpture and painting, both from Venice and the northern countries, mixed with ancient items such as coins and gems and inscriptions, drawings after the antique, but also natural specimens. Unfortunately, we don't know how this collection were arranged, since interiors, fashion and decoration have changed over the centuries. And the majority of the examples that survive dates to the 17th and 18th century. However, it's not difficult to imagine that the space would have looked very much like one of the rooms of Palazzo Vendramin Calergi, today the casino in Venice.
I might have a weird question here, but we need to jump back on the present first. So we both live in New York City, and we both know very well how cities, towns need to adapt their architecture based on what the space has to offer. So when it comes to Venice, a city built on water on hundreds of islands, that must have presented restrictions. So my question is actually, how did that affect the way they were putting buildings together?
Definitely, and being built on smaller islands connected just through canals meant limited space available for Venice. Palaces had to develop in height. They were narrow and very tall, and faced the Grand Canal, which was the main artery of the city. Since the light was mostly coming from that side, the facade had big windows, loggia, and later balconies. The ground floor, with access from the water, was mostly used for storage of goods and merchandises, and this is where you will find workshops and offices. The second floor was used for the owner's accommodation, and was reached through a staircase in the courtyard open at the back of the palace. The main reception hall, called Portico, was located here and was flanked by side rooms which serves as living rooms, bedrooms, or space for daily activities. The Portico was the most important room of the palace, and this is where the most valuable items of the family's collection were on display. Paintings were decorating its walls, usually covered with fabric and later with leather linings, while sculptures were standing on pedestals. Smaller items were probably arranged within cabinets, standing against the wall, along with chests and other pieces of furniture.
So at this point, it becomes really evident how culturally contaminated Venice was. So we've seen that in art and architecture. I'm assuming the streets must have looked very diverse as well. What I'm thinking of is foreigners. We've seen them painted, we've seen them in art already. So what role did foreigners play in this culturally contaminated Venice? And how did Venetians interact with them? Were there restrictions? Because they were merchants, so I'm assuming there's something to talk about right here.
Yes, foreigner residents and businessmen were actually welcome in Venice, and if you were walking around the streets, you would have heard different languages be spoken, and the Venetians themselves spoke more than one language. At the end of the 15th century, Philippe de Comines, the French ambassador to Venice, remarked that most of the people are foreigners. The same impression comes from the 16th century Venetian writer Francesco Sansovino. People from the most distant parts of the world gather here to trade and conduct business. People who differ among themselves in appearance, in costumes, and languages. Cultural richness in Venice was extremely encouraged, but there were limitations about what actually these foreigners could do, where they could live, where they could conduct their businesses, and how much money they could make. Some of this community became quite large, for example, the Germans and the Greeks. Others were smaller, for example, the Slavs, the Albanians, the Dalmatians. There were, of course, also Jewish and Turks, who were the most restricted in Venice, because they were considered to be infidels. The presence of all this culture is still visible around Venice, for example, in Campo dei Mori in Cannaregio. There are 3 niches carved inside a building with 3 images of men with turbans. According to the legend, these people represent 3 wealthy merchants, brothers, coming from Morea, which is coincide with the Peloponnese region now in the southern of Greece. They came to Venice in the 12th century to live there and build their business. They became so successful that they had to change their name into Mastelli. And I'm laughing because Mastelli means bucket of money, basically, that they were able to make with their own business. One of the houses of these brothers is probably the one known today as Palace of the Camel. It's called in this way because on the facade you can see a bas relief of a camel led by a man wearing an Eastern-style headdress. Other interesting elements appear on the facade. A small fountain resembling an oriental niche, which until not long ago was used by the gondoliers to quench their thirst, and a piece coming from an ancient Roman altar used as a column in the corner window on the left. The emphasis on the cultural richness of Venice is evident in another painting coming from the cycle of the Scuola Grande of San Giovanni Evangelista. The miracle performed by the True Cross this time is represented in the upper left of the painting, in the Palace of the Patriarch of Grado, where a possessed man is saved by the miracle-working relic. Vittore Carpaccio, however, a Venetian painter famous for his narrative depictions, seems to focus more on the lively Venetian everyday life than on the miracle himself. And in fact, great attention is devoted, for example, to the Rialto Bridge, which was the financial heart of the city, constructed in wood as it was then, with a row of shops on each side, and below that the Grand Canal, the main waterway of the city, animated by gondolas and gondoliers. Just a curiosity, gondolas were around Venice already in the 11th century. Another interesting detail about the painting, which is very much emphasized, are the colorful palaces with their characteristic chimneys. As for the cultural variety, On the bottom left of the scene, we can actually identify Armenian or Greek merchants in their black brim hats and sumptuous brocade robes, which were forbidden to the Venetians. The gondolier in the front is of African descent, and he was likely an ex-slave. Recent research has shown the slave trade was crucial to Venice's early economic growth, as early as the 8th century. Most of these slaves came from the central and eastern regions of Europe, around the Black Sea, but many of them came also from the coastal areas of Africa.
There are a lot of details in this painting, a lot of details, a lot of people, a lot of men. Where are the women? We don't see any in this painting.
It's a good question, also because Venetian women were very popular at that time. But women participation in public festivals were very limited. There were only few women could actually come to this kind of public parties, let's call them. All the others were attending these ceremonies from their balconies, basically. As you can see in this detail by Giovanni Mansueti, a detail that comes from another painting from the same cycle, which is interesting because these cycles really give us a lot of example about everyday life in Venice. Women are appearing through the window and they're showing off their beautiful carpets as a sign of celebration. And the same detail, far more remote and more difficult to see, is actually represented also by Gentile Bellini in his painting of the ceremony in the Piazza di San Marco.
So at this point, we've seen how cultural contamination and diversity influenced and affected art, architecture, society now. So another step, I think, should be industry. How did that affect the business that the Venetians were doing?
Well, it's interesting that you're asking this question because indeed very few manufacturers that now we identify as typical Venetians, I have to say they're not Venetians originally. Venetians did not invent it much on their own. They were very good as good savvy entrepreneurs as they were. They were good at appropriating and reinterpreting ideas that were coming from somewhere else. They use imported goods as a way to inspire their local craft industries that then became key element in Venice economy. Let's take, for example, the production of glass. The glass technique that made Venice popular was developed by Islamic glass blowers and imported to Venice possibly via Byzantium. It's a technology that encapsulated cross-cultural transfer and exemplifies how the Venetian learned to mimic luxury products from abroad and make them their own. By the 15th century, the quality of Venetian glass was so high that Venetians were even producing glass mosque lamps and exporting them into the Islamic world. Since we talk a lot about pilgrims today, let's take a look at this interesting pilgrim flask produced in Venice that shows the deep influence of Islamic models, not only for its shape, but also for its foliate and floral patterns.
What about printmaking? Because I remember learning in one of your classes that Venice was very big when it came to printmaking in the Renaissance. But most people tend to locate the birth of this industry in Germany. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, you remember well. Printmaking was indeed introduced in Germany in the 1450s, but by the end of the century, more books were published in Venice than in any other city in Europe. And the diversity that characterized at that time Venetian life, everyday life, was actually mirrored in the printed industry. Considerable numbers of ancient Greek texts were published, alongside books of Jewish history and translation of Arabic works, as well as costume books which offer visual representations of the appearance of different people. Certainly, one of the greatest editorial accomplishments of Venice remains the map created by Jacopo de Barbari in the 1500s. The mural-sized print was unprecedented in scale when it was published. It was printed in sections from 6 carved wooden blocks. Each part is so big that the individual sheets of paper were the largest ever produced in Europe at that time. When published, the view was very expensive, and that explains why only a dozen of original editions are known to survive. This print, in my opinion, really reflects the power of the intellect of Jacopo de Barbari. I like to imagine Jacopo and his assistant climbing up the city's 103 bell towers in order to survey the dense urban landscape and record every single building, canal, and open square. I really like how Jacopo de Barbari here really merges the topographical accuracy of his map with the mythological component. I don't know if you can spot it right away, but there are two strange figures in the map, which are two divinities: Mercury, the god of commerce, who presides over the city, while the watchful Neptune, god of the seas, rides his dolphin through the harbor.
We are now approaching the end of today's webinar. I know that there's much more that you could tell us about Venice, but you had put together a specific journey for us today, and that has come to an end. Before our conclusion, I would like to talk about another very important site in Venice whose conservation has been sponsored by Friends of Fai, and that's the much venerated Adriano Olivetti showroom. So what can you tell us about that?
Given Venice's innovative and almost visionary background, it's not surprising to learn that Adriano Olivetti decided to build in this city his most iconic showroom, which is an architectural jewel, in my opinion, designed by Carlo Scarpa in 1957. Scarpa merges together Venice's essential elements, the light and the water, the same that have inspired artists for centuries with their intricate game of reflections. The light, coming from the large windows, is reflected on the floor, whose colored glass tiles give the illusion of water transparency. The staircase at the center, with its floating steps, induce the visitor to imagine that he's walking on water. At the bottom of the staircase stands the Olivetti typewriter, a perfect example of balance and functionality, and a constant reminder to us of the creative spirits that have distinguished Italian manufacture for centuries. I do hope that by learning about the entrepreneurial spirit of the Venetians, who basically built an entire city out of the water against all the odds, can be of inspiration for the future generation of entrepreneurs today. Nestled in the heart of the Procuratie Vecchie, the Olivetti store truly represents a gem of Italian cultural heritage, a cultural heritage that we must remember and preserve as Fai does every day. So I would like to thank this wonderful organization for their incredible contribution.
Definitely what we learned today, especially in Venice's case, is that this extraordinary city is so much more than just a beautiful background. It is actually a brilliant example of resilience and innovation. And just like you said, it's important to learn about it, it's important to protect it, but also to invest in it. Dr. Baseggio, thank you very much once again. Thanks again to Friends of Fai for their work and for making today's webinar possible. And last but not least, I want to thank everybody who listened to us today.
Thank you, Advise, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, everybody.